My name is Kathleen O'Hara. I am 65 years old, a retired middle school teacher, and a widow. I spent decades teaching children to read, write, and believe in themselves, never imagining that one day I would be the one sitting at the edge of a celebration, silently questioned for my right to belong. On the night of my only son's wedding in Manhattan, I discovered just how far a mother could be pushed from the center of her own story. The ballroom was a spectacle of gold and glass. Chandeliers rained light onto tables draped in linen so white they seemed untouched by time. The walls carried mirrors so tall they reflected every sequin, every champagne bubble, every laugh that thought itself important. My son, Daniel, stood at the front with his bride, Marissa. They were radiant, framed by roses and candles, shining as if they had stepped out of a photograph meant for magazines. It should have been a moment for a mother to sit proudly, but pride turned bitter when a polite usher guided me not to the front, not to the family circle, but to a small table shoved against the swinging kitchen doors. Each time those doors flung open, steam rolled out with the clatter of plates and the sharp call of cooks. The smell of garlic and butter mingled with perfume and wine, reminding me that I had been placed at the border between service and celebration. I felt the stares, subtle but sharp, as if people wondered what mistake I had made to deserve such a seat. I did not have to wonder long. At the head table, Marissa's parents sat surrounded by their friends. Helen Kane, polished in silk and diamonds, leaned in close to a guest but spoke loudly enough for the sound to reach me. "She doesn't belong here." Her words landed like stones across polished marble. The laughter that followed was quick, bright, and cutting. Grant Kane lifted his glass, his smirk daring me to react, his eyes glinting with the satisfaction of a man confident in his place. For a moment my breath caught, but I refused to let my hands tremble. I rested my fingers against the tablecloth, steadying them against the linen. The sting was sharp, but deeper than humiliation was something older, a well-worn strength I had carried through years of raising Daniel after his father, Michael, passed. I leaned closer to myself, lips barely parting, and whispered, "Remember this." No one else heard, but I did. Those two words became my anchor. The irony was not lost on me. For months leading up to this wedding, I had already felt like an afterthought. Invitations to the rehearsal dinner or the family brunch arrived late or not at all. The photos displayed on the screen during the cocktail hour, childhood pictures of Daniel, teenage years, college triumphs, seemed to have cropped me out as if I had only existed at the edges. I was tolerated tonight because tradition required it, but my placement by the kitchen doors said more than any words could. From across the room, I caught Daniel's eyes. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, standing tall as though he belonged to this world of marble and champagne. But when his gaze slid toward me, I saw a flicker, a tension in his jaw. He quickly turned away, leaning toward his in-laws instead. My heart tightened. Not in anger, but in recognition of how far he had drifted, pulled by tides I could not command. Every clang of silver from those kitchen doors seemed to echo Helen's words. "She doesn't belong here," they repeated in my chest like a drum. And yet, beneath the hurt, something else began to rise. Humiliation has a way of sparking resolve if you let it burn long enough. I straightened my back, the pearls around my neck catching the light, the simple gold band on my finger grounding me in memory. Michael's absence hurt deeply, but the ring he once placed there reminded me of vows no laughter could erase. Around me, conversations flowed, glasses clinked, cameras flashed. No one paid me more than a glance, and that invisibility could have broken me, but I chose to let it sharpen me instead. I watched the people at the Kane table, their confidence resting on wealth and position, and I wondered if they had ever faced the kind of silence that tests a person's soul. I smiled, not because I was amused, but because they thought the story ended here. They believed the woman by the kitchen doors would fade into the shadows, a forgettable footnote in their glittering evening. But I had lived long enough to know that nothing is final until the last word is spoken. And tonight, I would hold mine. If you have ever been pushed aside, made to feel like a ghost at your own family's table, then perhaps you understand why I tell this story. This is not a tale of bitterness, but of what quiet dignity can carry through humiliation. Stay with me, and you will see how one whispered promise to myself, remember this, would shift everything. And if my story touches you, I invite you to share it, subscribe, and join me here. Together, we remind the world that it is never too late to claim our worth. That night, as the kitchen doors swung open and shut, I sat tall, pearls shining under the lights, my heart repeating the same 3 words. Remember this, when you are a widow raising a child alone, the cuts do not always come in dramatic slashes. They arrive in small ways, day after day until they shape the way others see you, and sometimes the way you see yourself. My story with Daniel and the Canes did not begin on his wedding night. It began long before, in the quiet years after Michael passed, when I learned that survival can be both exhausting and invisible. Michael was a steady man, a math teacher who believed that life's problems could always be solved with patience and reason. When he died suddenly, I found myself with a 10-year-old boy and a house that felt far too large for the 2 of us. I worked mornings and late evenings, correcting essays, leading after-school clubs, doing anything to stretch a teacher's salary far enough. There were no country club dinners, no charity galas, no photographs in glossy magazines, but there was Daniel's laughter over burned pancakes, his small hand holding mine on the walk to school, his head bent over homework at the kitchen table. To me, those moments were riches. To the Canes, they would always be evidence of what I lacked. I taught for 35 years. My students still write to me sometimes, reminding me that I once told them they could be more than what people expected. Yet in the Cane household, my identity shrank to the school teacher. I heard the word on their lips the first time I visited their townhouse. It wasn't admiration, it was dismissal, as if shaping young minds was a lesser life. I felt the wall of class between us long before Helen ever whispered at the wedding. And yet, not all of my life was small. There was my brother Kevin, who had moved to the West Coast decades ago. Kevin was a private man allergic to attention, but every Christmas without fail, an envelope arrived. Inside was always the same, a simple card with a handwritten note, sometimes just a line or 2. He never sent expensive gifts, only words. I kept them all in a carved wooden box on the shelf beside my books. Over the years, that box became my reminder that family could live far apart, but still reach across distance. Daniel would glance at the cards sometimes, curious, but Kevin remained a shadowy figure in his life. Someone known more through my stories than through presents. The Canes never asked about Kevin, nor did they care to. To them, my family ended with me. Their world was filled with patrons, board members, and property investors, people who measured value by how loudly others applauded. When Daniel began spending more time with Marissa, I noticed subtle shifts. He started talking about neighborhoods in terms of desirable and up and coming, about vacations measured by exclusivity rather than joy. I listened quietly, though each word felt like another small cut. He was slipping into a world where my years of sacrifice and teaching would always weigh less than Helen's guest list. I remember one evening months before the wedding, Daniel called to tell me he had accepted a new position at a bank. I congratulated him, proud as always, until he admitted that it had come through Marissa's father's connections. "It's just how things are done, Mom," he said. I could hear the unease in his voice, but he brushed it aside quickly. Another cut, another reminder of how different his path had become. By the time the wedding invitation arrived, late, after I had already heard about the engagement party I was not invited to, I knew my place in their eyes. The envelope sat heavy in my hands, the script elegant, the card thick with embossed flowers. I smiled anyway. I ironed my gown. I chose a pearl necklace that had been Michael's gift to me one anniversary. And on the morning of the wedding, I opened the wooden box, touched one of Kevin's Christmas cards, and reminded myself that not everyone measured worth in chandeliers and champagne. Still, humiliation at 1,000 small cuts does not disappear with one touch of memory. Walking into that ballroom, I felt every moment of dismissal layered over me like heavy fabric. Each late invitation, each glance that told me I was present but not wanted, each polite smile that concealed judgment. It was no single wound that hurt, but the accumulation. That night, as the laughter rolled from the cane table, I thought back to those Christmas cards. Kevin's handwriting had always been steady, confident, almost old-fashioned. I could hear his voice in one particular line from years ago. "Keep your head high, Kath. The world doesn't get to decide your worth." I had forgotten that line until the moment I needed it most. And so, even as Helen's words echoed, "She doesn't belong here," I placed my hand against my heart, remembering. I was not only the widow at the kitchen doors, I was Michael's wife, Daniel's mother, Kevin's sister. I was more than the accumulation of cuts. I was the one who had endured them and still stood. I did not know then that the box of cards would matter again, that Kevin's quiet constancy would one day enter the story in a way the Canes could not imagine. But I knew this much. Every slight, every late invitation, every whisper was already recorded in my memory, and memory has its own form of justice. That night, as I lifted a glass of water to my lips, I caught sight of the kitchen doors swinging open once more. Another gust of heat, another clang of plates. And I told myself again quietly, "Remember this." The invitation had arrived later than it should have, tucked into my mailbox like an afterthought. By then, I already knew about the engagement party, the bridal shower, even the brunch at Helen's club that I had not been asked to attend. When the cream-colored envelope finally appeared, I held it as if it were a verdict rather than an invitation. The edges were embossed with roses, the lettering flourished in expensive ink, but none of its finery could disguise the message. I was welcome, but not wanted. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that I was Daniel's mother, and no amount of delay could erase that fact. Still, when I held the invitation under the light of my kitchen lamp, I felt the sting of being excluded from the milestones leading up to the ceremony. It was not simply the absence of my name from guest lists. It was the quiet confirmation that I had been pushed to the edge of my son's new world. In the days leading up to the wedding, I walked through the quiet of my house and tried to remember the sound of Michael's voice. He would have known what to say. He always did. He had a way of folding his arm around me when the world was unkind, reminding me that love mattered more than appearances. Without him, I had to hold myself together, stitching dignity out of silence. On the morning of the wedding, I chose my dress carefully. Navy blue, simple but elegant, with sleeves that brushed my wrists. Around my neck, I placed the pearl necklace Michael had given me long ago, and on my finger, the gold band that never left. These were my reminders that I was not just a guest tucked by the kitchen doors. I was the woman who had raised Daniel with steady hands, the one who had carried the weight when life had tried to empty us. Before leaving the house, I sat at my dining table and wrote a letter. Not an elaborate one, just a few lines on heavy paper with my best handwriting. I told Daniel how proud I was of him, how I wished him joy, how I hoped he would remember that strength and kindness mattered more than anything his new family's wealth could provide. Alongside the letter, I placed a check, modest by Kane standards, but significant for me. I wanted it to be enough to show support without being measured as inadequate. I sealed the envelope with care, sliding it into my handbag. That letter was not for the Canes, nor for show. It was for my son, a reminder that beneath all the noise and posturing, his mother's love was constant. The gift table stood near the entrance of the ballroom, draped in silk and crowded with ornate packages. Crystal boxes, silver trays, envelopes tucked into cards printed with gold leaf. I approached quietly, my heels clicking against the polished floor. For a moment, no one noticed me. Then Helen appeared nearby, speaking to another guest about the grandeur of the venue. Her eyes flicked toward me, and though she smiled politely, there was something dismissive in the glance, as if she were saying, "At least she remembered to contribute." I placed my envelope among the others, resting it where the light caught my handwriting. I stepped back, smoothing the front of my gown, and reminded myself that it was enough. Daniel would find it. He would read my words. And perhaps, in the quiet of some later evening, he would understand what I could not say aloud. Throughout the reception, my thoughts returned again and again to that table. I imagined Daniel opening the envelope, reading my words, hearing my voice in the silence. But the truth is, the envelope became just one more object in a sea of wealth and extravagance. I saw staff collecting gifts, stacking them neatly, and I wondered if mine would be overlooked, buried under glittering wrappings and heavy ribbons. I did not know then how important that question would become. I did not know that the letter I left with careful hands would disappear into the background, forgotten until someone else uncovered it. All I knew in that moment was that I had done my part. I had spoken with ink what my voice was not given the stage to say. Back at my table by the kitchen doors, I folded my hands in my lap and tried to still the ache inside me. Each clang of dishes reminded me where I sat. Each burst of laughter from the cane table reminded me how little they cared. Yet in the midst of it, I felt the faint comfort of knowing that somewhere in that ballroom was my letter, my words, waiting for the right moment. I lifted my water glass, letting the cool rim steady me. Around me, the music swelled, the champagne flowed, and the lights glittered like stars captured indoors. I was invisible to most, but not to myself. And as I sat there, I whispered again, "Remember this." For even the smallest gestures, a letter, a pearl necklace, a whispered promise, can carry weight beyond what anyone imagines. The hotel that hosted the reception looked more like a palace than any place meant for ordinary families. Crystal chandeliers hung so low they seemed to drip light onto the heads of the guests. Gold leaf framed every mirror, and the marble floor gleamed as though polished only for this single evening. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, imported in such abundance that even the staff whispered about the extravagance. It was a world designed to impress, to declare that the Kane family's wealth and influence were beyond question. I stepped into that space, feeling the shift immediately. Conversations hushed and then resumed, as if my presence reminded some of the guests of something unscripted. The photographs displayed near the entrance told their own story, pictures of Daniel and Marissa through the years. Their smiling faces appeared at graduations, vacations, and milestone birthdays. Yet in frame after frame, there was no trace of me. It was as if Daniel had been raised by invisible hands, his childhood edited to fit the narrative of perfection the Kanes preferred to showcase. I lingered for a moment near one of the displays, studying a picture of Daniel at 12 years old, standing proudly in his baseball uniform. I remembered that day well. I had stood at the edge of the field shouting encouragement while balancing the weight of groceries in one hand. I had washed the dirt from that jersey myself, staying up late so it would be clean for the next game. In the photograph, none of that remained. It was Daniel alone, cropped clean of the woman who had stood behind the camera. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Helen's voice floated near me. She wore a gown the color of champagne, sequins glimmering like stars. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that kept score. "We wanted the guests to see how well Daniel has blossomed. He fits so naturally into our circle." The unspoken message was clear. He belonged to them now. I simply nodded, unwilling to let her see the wound. Instead, I turned toward the ballroom where the music had begun to swell. Daniel and Marissa were being ushered in, hands clasped, faces glowing beneath the lights. For a moment, my heart lifted, remembering the small boy who once clung to my skirt on the first day of school. He had grown into a man, and he looked happy. That was enough, I told myself. That had to be enough. Later, during the family photographs, the pattern repeated itself. I was guided gently to the side, placed in a corner frame while the canes filled the center. At one point, I was excluded altogether, the photographer waving me back with a quick apology. Daniel caught my eye then, his expression tightening. He walked over, placing his hand lightly on my arm. His words were barely above a whisper. "Mom, please, don't make a scene. They'll get upset if you push back." I stared at him, feeling the weight of his request settle deep into me. "I'm not making a scene," I said softly. "I'm only standing where I've always stood." He looked away quickly, already drawn back to Marissa and her parents. The photographer called again, and Daniel hurried back into place. I remained where I was, invisible in the glitter of the flashbulbs. The laughter from the cane side of the room swelled throughout the evening. Guests compared vacation homes, board positions, and investment returns. Their words filled the air like currency, exchanged for approval. I listened, not because I belonged in their world, but because I wanted to understand the weight pressing down on my son. This was the life he was stepping into, a life where value was measured not by integrity, but by influence. At my table near the kitchen doors, the sound of the staff moving behind me became a counterpoint to the ballroom's grandeur. Plates clattered, orders were called out, and the scent of garlic drifted each time the doors opened. I sat between two worlds, the luxury of the canes and the labor of those who served them. Neither side seemed to notice me. Still, I held my posture. I lifted my chin, letting the pearls at my throat catch the light. Every so often I whispered my own reminder, "Remember this, for humiliation may arrive like a tide, but dignity, once planted, can hold against it." Daniel passed by me once more during the evening. His smile looked practiced, his laughter strained. I wondered if he felt the pull between the woman who had raised him and the family now binding him tighter each day. His shoulders squared, his words polite, but there was a flicker in his eyes that betrayed unease. A mother knows when her child carries a weight too heavy, even if he will not admit it. The music swelled again, couples rising to dance. I remained at my table, hands folded, eyes calm. Around me, the ballroom shimmered with wealth, but I felt the hollowness of its glow. I reminded myself once more, this was not the end of my story. This was only the beginning. And in the quiet between songs, I told myself, "Remember this." The sound of glass striking glass carried across the ballroom. Grant Kane had risen from his seat, his champagne flute lifted high, the crystal catching the light with a brilliance as sharp as his smirk. The music softened, and conversations quieted as guests turned, their faces toward him. He was a man who relished attention, who spoke with the confidence of someone used to rooms bending to his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone rich with the ease of practiced charm. "What a joy it is to gather here tonight and celebrate this union. Our Marissa, radiant as ever, and Daniel, who is truly fortunate to have been welcomed into our family." He paused to let the polite laughter ripple, though his eyes flicked toward me with deliberate calculation. And of course, how lucky we all are to be joined by every guest here tonight. Well, most of them. The laughter that followed was louder this time, sharper. I felt it strike me like cold water poured over my head. Grant raised his glass higher, his smirk deepening. Some people, after all, may not quite belong in a place like this, but we're generous enough to let them share in our joy, aren't we? His words, dressed in wit, landed like stones. The applause was scattered, but sufficient to make the insult feel sanctioned. I sat very still, my hand resting lightly on the tablecloth, my fingers curling inward to keep from trembling. My face remained calm, lips pressed into a quiet smile. I had spent too many years teaching children to know the value of composure when cruelty sought reaction. Silence can be sharper than protest, and dignity often unsettles those who mock it. Still, my heart thudded hard against my ribs. Around me, guests exchanged glances. Some laughed nervously, eager not to fall out of step with the host. Others looked down at their glasses, unwilling to meet my eyes. The weight of their silence pressed against me as surely as the insult itself. And then, as Grant took a sip of his champagne and the room shifted back toward conversation, a voice brushed past me, low and hesitant. "It's not right." I turned slightly. A young server, no older than 20, had leaned close while passing with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. His words were barely more than a whisper, yet they rang louder in my chest than all of Grant's mocking laughter. His eyes flicked toward me with quiet solidarity before he moved on, swallowed again by his duties. In that fleeting moment, I felt something stir. It was not victory, not yet, but a reminder that the world still held witnesses willing to see. Even the smallest acknowledgement can feel like a lifeline when humiliation tries to erase you. I gave the young man a subtle nod, gratitude written in the tilt of my chin, though he did not linger to see it. Daniel sat frozen for a moment after his father-in-law's words. His face shifted between discomfort and duty, torn in front of everyone he was trying to please. Marissa leaned close, whispering something to him, her smile tight. He forced a laugh, clinking his glass against hers, and the moment slipped away like a shadow under bright light. Yet I caught the flicker in his eyes, the shame he could not voice. I sat straighter, letting the pearls at my throat catch the glow of the chandeliers. Grant's words could not strip me of who I was. They could not erase the years of mornings when I braided Daniel's hair for picture day, the late nights when I graded papers at the kitchen table while he slept, the afternoons I spent walking him home in the rain with grocery bags cutting into my hands. I belonged because I had built the life he now carried into this room, even if no one here cared to acknowledge it. The music swelled again, the chatter resumed, and laughter filled the corners of the ballroom. Yet for me, the moment had etched itself deep. My humiliation was now carved into memory, no longer just a passing sting. And with memory comes a strange kind of power. I whispered to myself once more, the words steady on my tongue. Remember this. The mantra had become a rhythm in my blood, a quiet vow that I would not let this night end the way they intended. I raised my glass, not to join their toast, but to mark my own. I drank water instead of champagne, the coolness settling my breath. Around me, they celebrated their cleverness, their wealth, their spectacle. They believed they had put me in my place, but I knew better. Life has a way of turning tables, often when least expected. All I needed was to remain steady, to wait, to remember. And as the kitchen doors swung open again behind me, sending a rush of steam and the clang of pans into the room, I smiled faintly. The sound no longer embarrassed me. It reminded me instead that even those hidden behind doors carry voices. And sometimes the smallest voice is the one that lingers longest. That night, while Grant Kane basked in his own laughter, I carried something he did not recognize. Patience. And patience, when paired with memory, is stronger than any toast raised against you. The ballroom air had grown heavy, stifling in its perfume and its judgment. My chest tightened beneath the pearls, and I knew I needed a moment away from the chandeliers, the laughter, the mocking voices that clung to me like smoke. I excused myself quietly and walked down a corridor lined with gilded mirrors until I found the restroom. The door shut behind me, and the silence that followed was almost startling. I leaned against the cool marble sink, letting my breath come in shallow bursts. My reflection stared back at me, framed by harsh light. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman looking out from the mirror. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her mouth pressed thin, her back slightly bent under the weight of a humiliation she refused to show. I pressed my palms flat against the counter, gripping the stone until my knuckles whitened. The sound of muffled music from the ballroom bled faintly through the walls. But here, at least, no one could see me unravel. Tears came suddenly, sharp and unbidden. I let them fall, just for a moment, my body shaking as though the release might carry away the ache in my chest. 35 years of teaching had taught me composure, but even teachers need a place to break. I covered my mouth with my hand, muffling the sob that rose before it could echo in the empty space. When the trembling subsided, I reached into my small clutch and pulled out the two objects I had carried like talismans. The first was my wedding band, simple gold, its edges worn smooth by decades of life with Michael. I twisted it gently around my finger, remembering the day he slid it on, his voice steady as he promised that nothing in the world could diminish our worth together. The second was a folded card, edges creased with years. It was the last birthday card Michael had given me before he passed. The handwriting was bold and certain. Kath, you are worth more than this world will ever admit. Don't forget it. Love, always. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained unshaken. As I read them, the tears on my cheeks cooled into something firmer. I pressed the card to my chest, closing my eyes. You'd tell me to stand up straight, wouldn't you, Michael? I whispered into the empty room. And then I did. I pulled my shoulders back, lifted my chin, and met my own reflection again. This time, I recognized the woman looking back, the same woman who had raised a child alone, who had taught hundreds of students to find their voices, who had walked through storms heavier than any toast or whisper. I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue, careful not to smudge the small effort I had made with makeup. I tucked the card back into my bag, slid the ring securely on my finger, and steadied my breath. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it now was something sturdier, the reminder that I had lived through worse and carried love that could not be erased by silk gowns or cruel laughter. The restroom door creaked as I pushed it open, and the music swelled louder again. I stood in the hallway for a moment, allowing the noise and light to wash over me. Guests passed by without pausing, their conversations filled with plans for vacations and board meetings. None of them noticed the quiet woman standing straighter than before, her eyes steadier, her steps measured with purpose. I walked back toward my table by the kitchen doors. Each step was deliberate, as though I were placing a stone walkway beneath my own feet. My heels clicked softly, but I imagined them striking like drumbeats. By the time I reached the ballroom again, I had tucked my sorrow away, not gone, but transformed into resolve. The kitchen doors swung open behind me as I took my seat. The smell of garlic and butter swept past, and the sound of pans clanging filled the air. I no longer flinched. Instead, I let it pass through me, grounding me in the reality that dignity is not something granted. It is something carried. I sat straighter than before, folding my hands in my lap, letting the light catch the pearls at my throat and the ring at my finger. Around me, the canes laughed, the music played, and Daniel moved like a man caught in two currents. But I was no longer adrift. I had remembered who I was, and that memory gave me strength enough to endure. And once again, quietly, I whispered to myself, "Remember this." It was no longer a plea. It was a promise. I had just returned to my table when I noticed her. She was standing by the edge of the dance floor, hesitant, almost swallowed by the gowns and tuxedos that whirled around her. Her dress was simple, pale lavender that did not shimmer the way the others did. For a moment she looked as misplaced as I felt. Though younger, her shoulders drawn in as if she knew too well what it meant to be overlooked. She caught my eye, and in that instant something unspoken passed between us. She walked slowly across the room, careful not to draw attention, weaving between tables until she reached me. When she leaned down, her voice was soft enough that only I could hear. "You don't have to sit through this alone." Her words surprised me. I blinked, studying her face. She was young, no more than her early 20s, with kind eyes that seemed too open for the sharpness of the Kane family. I searched my memory and realized I had seen her earlier, lingering near Helen during the photographs, though never in the center of things. "I'm Emily," she whispered. "My mother's a cousin of Helen's. Technically, that makes me part of this family, but—" She glanced around the ballroom, her mouth tightening. "They don't really treat me like it." I nodded slowly, understanding more than she could know. "Kathleen," I said quietly, "Daniel's mother." Her eyes softened further. "I know. I watched them seat you here. It wasn't right." For a moment, emotion welled in my throat. It wasn't the kind of grand defense one imagines receiving. It was something smaller, quieter, and perhaps more powerful for its honesty. To be seen, to be acknowledged in a room that thrived on exclusion. It was like a hand reaching into darkness. Emily pulled out the chair beside me and sat down, ignoring the way Helen glanced in our direction. She leaned closer. "They don't think I matter much either. Wrong college, wrong look, wrong connections. I get invited because they can't quite erase blood ties, but they never let me forget that I don't measure up." Her confession struck me. It wasn't bitterness in her voice, it was recognition. In her youth, she had already felt the sting of being dismissed, and in me, perhaps she saw a reflection of her own quiet exile. We spoke softly, careful not to be overheard. She asked about my work, about Daniel's childhood, about Michael. I told her small stories. Daniel learning to ride his bike, Michael's corny jokes at the dinner table, the smell of chalk that clung to my clothes after long days teaching. Emily listened as if these details mattered, as if they were treasures rather than trivialities. At one point, she smiled sadly. "You know, they'll never understand. People like Helen and Grant, they measure everything in surface shine. They can't see what lasts." She paused, then added, "But I can. And I think Daniel can too, even if he's forgotten it for now." Her words planted something in me, not hope exactly, but a reminder that truth is rarely erased completely. Beneath Daniel's polished suit and strained smile, there might still be the boy who once looked for me in the stands after every game. Emily reached for her glass of water, glancing toward the Kane table. "If they catch me here too long, they'll say I'm trying too hard. But I just wanted you to know, you're not the only one they treat this way." "Thank you," I murmured. It seemed inadequate, but gratitude filled my chest. Sometimes the smallest kindness feels larger than anything else. She gave a small nod, her expression earnest. "Then let's call it even. You remember me, and I'll remember you. Deal?" "Deal," I said. And for the first time that evening, I felt the corners of my mouth lift in something close to a genuine smile. Emily rose quietly, smoothing her dress. Before she left, she leaned close once more. "Hold on tonight. Not everything ends the way they plan it." Then she slipped back into the crowd, disappearing among the glitter and noise, leaving me with her words echoing inside me. I sat back at my table, the bustle of waiters and guests resuming around me. The humiliation of earlier still clung to me, but now there was a thread of connection running through it. Emily had offered me something the Kanes could never manufacture: solidarity. I closed my eyes briefly, holding the memory of her kind eyes, and whispered again to myself, "Remember this." The ballroom had settled into a rhythm. The music swayed between jazz standards and modern beats. Couples circled the dance floor, and waiters darted between tables with trays of champagne. I sat in my seat near the kitchen doors, my back straight, my pearls gleaming under the lights. To most in the room, I was invisible. But invisibility, I had learned, often comes with an advantage. You see what others overlook. From my vantage point, I noticed the way Helen's smile stiffened whenever Marissa leaned too long in Daniel's arm. I saw the way Grant's laughter boomed louder than necessary, a signal that he was the true host of the evening. And I saw Daniel himself, standing at the edge of every conversation, trying to mirror the confidence of his in-laws, though his eyes flickered restlessly when he thought no one was watching. It was then that my handbag, resting on the chair beside me, began to vibrate softly. I glanced around, ensuring no one paid me any mind, and slipped the phone into my lap. The glow of the screen lit my face faintly in the dimness of the corner. One new message: Kevin. The name alone steadied me. My brother's texts were rare, usually short, often delayed by time zones and his endless work. He preferred phone calls on birthdays, cards at Christmas, silence in between. Yet tonight, in the midst of glitter and disdain, his name had appeared. My heart quickened as I tapped the screen. "Are you there yet? I'm almost outside." I read the words twice, certain I had imagined them. My pulse raced, not from fear, but from the sudden shift they carried. Kevin was coming. To this place, to this ballroom, to this evening I had endured alone until now. I tucked the phone quickly beneath the tablecloth as though hiding a secret flame from the wind. Around me, laughter rose again, oblivious. Helen leaned across her table, whispering into Grant's ear with a look of smug delight. Daniel clapped politely at a toast offered by one of the Kane cousins. Marissa smiled with precision, the perfect hostess. None of them knew the message that had just altered the ground beneath my feet. I slipped the phone into my bag once more, careful not to reveal the tremor in my hands. Kevin's presence was a memory I had carried for decades through the cards he sent, the phone calls that bridged holidays, the faint anchor of family he provided from afar. But now, he was minutes away from walking into this gilded room. The thought steadied me and unsettled me all at once. What would happen when he arrived? Would anyone recognize him? Would the Kanes understand who he was, or would they see only another guest, unnoticed at first? I did not dwell on the answer. It was enough to know he was near. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne, offering me a flute. I declined politely, asking instead for water. He nodded, disappearing through the swinging doors behind me. The burst of kitchen noise that followed reminded me of my exile, but the message in my bag reminded me that exile was temporary. I folded my hands in my lap, breathing slowly. The humiliation of earlier still lingered, but beneath it was a current of suspense, as though the air itself had shifted. Every laugh, every clink of glass, every swell of music felt like the build-up to something unseen. I thought of Michael then, of how he had always admired Kevin. "Your brother," he used to say, "he moves quietly, but the world bends around him." Michael had been right. Kevin had built his life far from ours, in rooms I had never entered, in circles I had never touched. Yet despite all that distance, he was still my brother. And tonight, that bond was about to matter. I sat taller, adjusting the pearls at my throat. My reflection caught briefly in the mirrored walls of the ballroom. The woman staring back no longer looked quite so out of place. She looked like someone waiting for the right moment, someone who knew a truth hidden from everyone else in the room. My phone buzzed again. Another message. 2 minutes. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying my breath. 2 minutes until the doors opened. 2 minutes until invisibility shifted into presence. 2 minutes until memory gave way to revelation. The music swelled, the laughter rose, the chandeliers gleamed brighter. I whispered to myself once more, quietly but firmly, "Remember this." The evening seemed to hold its breath just before the blow landed. Helen rose from her seat, elegant in sequins, her smile as polished as the stem of the champagne flute she held. She tapped it gently, the chime ringing across the ballroom until the chatter faded into silence. All eyes turned toward her, and with a tilt of her head, she gestured for Daniel to join her. "My son-in-law," she said warmly, her hand resting lightly on his arm, "has something to share." Daniel hesitated. I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his smile faltered as he looked at her. But the weight of expectation pressed him forward. He stepped into the center of the room, blinking against the glare of chandeliers. Thank you," he began, his voice unsteady. He looked at Marissa first, then at Helen, then out toward the rows of faces waiting. "This night means everything to us. I'm grateful to be part of such a remarkable family." He swallowed, his throat tight. Then Helen leaned closer, her whisper not quite hidden from the microphone. "And your mother." A ripple of anticipation spread through the guests. Daniel's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked in my direction. For a moment, I thought he might resist. For a moment, I saw the boy I raised, the one who used to defend me on the playground when children mocked my old station wagon. But the moment passed. "My mother." His voice wavered. "My mother is lucky. Lucky to have been invited tonight." The words struck harder than any toast Grant had made. They fell into the silence like stones, heavy and unyielding. Laughter followed, scattered but cruel, and it filled the space with the echo of my exclusion. I felt the sting reach deep, pulling breath from my chest. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my smile quiet and unshaken. Inside, however, the wound pulsed hot. It wasn't only the humiliation, it was hearing my own son, my Daniel, repeat the script handed to him by a family that measured worth by status. It was the betrayal in his eyes as he looked down, unable to meet mine. The ballroom erupted again in chatter, music resuming as if nothing had happened. But in that moment, the air had shifted. I whispered to myself, steady, calm, almost inaudible. "Remember this." When Daniel finally slipped away from the crowd, I followed at a distance. I found him in the hallway outside the ballroom, his head bowed, his hands braced against the wall as though he needed it to hold him upright. "Daniel," I said softly. He turned quickly, his eyes wide with guilt. "Mom, please, don't make this worse." "Worse?" My voice was low, but it carried the weight of what I felt. "You repeated their words. You called me lucky to be invited." His face twisted, shame and frustration battling within him. "They pushed me into it. You don't understand how they are. If I don't play along, they'll make things harder for Marissa, for me. I just need you to, please don't draw more attention. Don't fight them. Let it go." I studied him in the dim light of the corridor. His suit was perfect, his hair immaculate, but beneath the surface was the boy I once rocked to sleep, the boy who used to bring me wildflowers plucked from the schoolyard. He was still there, but buried under fear of losing favor with a family that had already stolen his voice. I stepped closer, placing a hand lightly on his arm. My smile was calm, the same one I wore in the ballroom. "Daniel, I haven't done anything. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't fought. All I have done is sit and watch. Do you see how little it takes to make them afraid?" He looked at me, torn, his lips parting as though he wanted to say more. But the music swelled again inside the ballroom, and Helen's voice floated faintly through the doors, calling his name. He exhaled, shoulders slumping. "I have to go?" I released his arm slowly. "Go then," I said quietly. "But remember this moment. One day, you'll wish you had chosen differently." He turned and walked back toward the light, the doors closing behind him. I remained in the hallway for a long moment, breathing slowly, my hand still tingling where it had rested on his sleeve. When I returned to my seat by the kitchen doors, the noise of the ballroom washed over me again. Yet something within me had shifted. The humiliation was still raw, but beneath it was resolve, sharpened and steady. I whispered once more to myself, "Remember this," and held the words close, like a shield. Outside, the city hummed its usual symphony, horns, footsteps, the distant whine of sirens. But inside the ballroom, the air felt heavy, sealed by chandeliers and laughter that no longer reached me. I had just returned to my table when the rhythm of the evening faltered. It began with the faintest shift, a door opening at the far end of the hall, not the kitchen doors behind me, but the grand entrance at the front. Heads turned, conversation softened, and a ripple moved through the crowd. Through the wide glass doors, I saw the reflection of headlights. A sleek black sedan had pulled to the curb outside, its polished surface catching the glow of the street lamps. The car door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, the chill of the city night clinging to his coat. A second man followed, a younger assistant dressed in a dark suit, his earpiece glinting faintly. He moved ahead, opening the door and scanning the room with a quiet authority. "Mr. O'Hara?" the assistant murmured, his voice low but steady. "The board is on standby." And then Kevin appeared. My brother did not stride in with arrogance, nor did he announce himself. He simply walked. Yet the weight of his presence shifted the entire room. The music, still playing from the DJ's booth, seemed to stumble for a beat before softening. Guests straightened in their seats. The clink of silverware halted mid-air. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim in reverence as Kevin crossed the threshold. He wore a charcoal suit, tailored but not ostentatious. His hair, touched with gray, caught the light in silver strands. There was no need for jewels or loud colors. The strength of his presence was in the calm gravity he carried. His gaze swept the room once, unhurried, before landing exactly where it was meant to, on me. I felt the breath catch in my chest. My brother, who had built his life quietly on the other side of the country, who had existed in my world only through Christmas cards and brief phone calls, was suddenly here, in this gilded hall where I had been pushed to the margins. The Canes noticed him instantly. Helen's smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Grant's laughter dried mid-sentence, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another, trying to place the face that carried such unspoken weight. Kevin's assistant remained a step behind him, his posture formal, his eyes scanning the crowd. But Kevin himself did not waver. He did not nod to the hosts. He did not acknowledge the grandeur of the setting. Instead, he walked through the crowd as though the chandeliers and gold trim were no more significant than wallpaper. And I watched him, heart pounding, as the room fell quieter with every step he took. He reached the far side of the ballroom where my table sat tucked against the swinging kitchen doors. The irony was not lost on me. They had placed me at the edge, but in doing so, they had unknowingly cleared the path for him to walk directly toward me. The assistant leaned slightly closer as Kevin approached, his voice pitched low, professional. "Your presence is noted, sir. Do you want me to announce—" Kevin raised a hand almost imperceptibly, silencing him. No announcements, no speeches, just presence. When he finally reached me, he paused. The hum of whispers filled the air, every head turned, every camera phone half raised, and still he said nothing. He only glanced at the empty chair beside me, then at the pearls around my neck, before resting a hand briefly on the back of my chair. I met his eyes, and for the first time that evening I felt no need to whisper my mantra. I didn't have to remind myself to remember this. The moment was etching itself without effort. Around us, the ballroom held its silence. Helen clutched her glass tighter, her knuckles whitening. Grant shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. Daniel froze near the head table, his eyes wide as though he had seen a ghost step out of memory. Marissa reached for his arm, her fingers tightening, her face pale. The assistant hovered, a shadow that emphasized Kevin's quiet authority without distracting from it. He was the subtle punctuation to Kevin's sentence, the reminder that my brother did not walk alone. And yet, for all the weight that entered with him, Kevin himself remained composed, understated. He did not need grandeur. He was enough. I sat straighter in my chair, my heart steady. For the first time that night, I no longer felt alone in the glow of chandeliers that had sought to blind me. Kevin was here, and nothing would be the same again. Kevin didn't hurry. His steps were measured, deliberate, the kind of stride that belonged to someone who had long ago learned the world would wait for him. The assistant lingered a few paces behind, hands folded, as if even he understood that what was about to happen did not require protocol or announcement. I rose slowly from my chair. My knees trembled, but not from fear. The ballroom's golden light caught on my pearls and the ring on my hand, and I stood taller than I had all evening. Every eye in the room followed Kevin as he approached, the whispers swelling like a tide pressing against the walls. When he reached me, there was no hesitation. He extended his arms, and I stepped into them. The warmth of his embrace closed around me, solid and unshakable, as if decades of distance had folded into nothing. For a heartbeat, the ballroom vanished. The chandeliers, the marble, the laughter. It was just Kevin and me. Brother and sister, bound by a history no one else in that room could claim. He held me a moment longer than necessary, enough to make the silence stretch. Then he turned, keeping one arm loosely draped around my shoulders, and faced the crowd. His voice was calm, steady, and low, but it carried across the hushed ballroom with the force of certainty. "This," he said, "is my sister." The words dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples across every table. A murmur rose immediately, gasps fluttering like startled birds. I felt the shift in the air, the recalibration of eyes and minds. They had spent the evening treating me like an outsider, a woman tolerated only by duty. In a single breath, Kevin had rewritten the script. Helen's face blanched, the polish of her smile cracking. She pressed her lips together, trying to recover, but her eyes betrayed her. Grant coughed into his glass as though the champagne had turned sour. Marissa froze, her hand gripping Daniel's sleeve with quiet desperation. And Daniel, my Daniel. His eyes locked on me, confusion and shame flooding his face. He stood rigid at the head table, caught between two worlds, the man he was trying to become and the boy he once had been. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He looked away, then back again, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just heard. Kevin did not embellish. He did not list accomplishments or history. He simply stood beside me, tall and steady, his arm resting on my shoulder as if to say that nothing more needed to be explained. Sister, family, belonging. It was all there in the simplicity of the word. I let myself breathe. For hours I had endured humiliation in silence. For hours I had whispered, "Remember this," only to myself. Now, the room remembered it with me. The laughter that had cut me earlier could no longer echo freely. The chandeliers that had seemed to spotlight my exclusion now cast light on the bond that no wealth could erase. Guests exchanged looks, some curious, some startled, others already whispering hurriedly to identify the man who had just altered the tone of the evening. Phones appeared discreetly, screens glowing in laps and behind raised glasses, searches already underway. Yet none of that mattered to me in that moment. What mattered was the strength of Kevin's presence beside me and the way the room bent under the weight of one simple truth. I belonged. Daniel finally moved. He stepped away from Marissa's side, his face pale, his eyes darting between me and Kevin. For the first time all night, he seemed unsure of the ground beneath him. His hands twitched at his sides, and I saw the fracture, the line where loyalty to appearances clashed with blood and memory. Marissa tugged lightly at his arm, urging him back. He hesitated, torn. His gaze met mine briefly, and I saw it. The recognition he could not hide. The mother he had called lucky to be invited was no longer small in the shadow of the Kane family. She was standing tall with her brother at her side. I pressed my hand gently against Kevin's sleeve, steadying myself. My voice, though quiet, was strong enough for him alone. "You came." "Of course," he murmured. "You're my sister." The murmurs in the room rose again, but beneath them was a silence more profound, the silence of faces realizing that the story they thought they were telling had shifted course. The Kanes no longer held the stage. I looked out at the sea of eyes, my smile calm, unbroken. I did not need to speak. Kevin's words had been enough. The humiliation of the evening had been answered not with shouting, not with retaliation, but with a truth so simple it could not be denied. And inside me, something long bent straightened at last. I belonged, not because the Kanes allowed it, but because family cannot be erased by disdain. My brother's hand on my shoulder proved that. I lifted my chin and whispered again, for myself and for Michael, whose ring still circled my finger, "Remember this." For a few seconds after Kevin spoke, the ballroom seemed suspended in air. His words still echoed, "This is my sister," and no one dared fill the silence. Then, as if on cue, the murmurs began, soft, cautious, like ripples spreading across still water. I heard them first from the table nearest the entrance. A man leaned toward his companion, his voice hushed but distinct enough to travel. "That's Kevin O'Hara, from MedShield Systems." The name flickered through the room like a spark on dry grass. Another voice, female, floated just behind me. "He's in Forbes. 400, last year's list. I saw his name." A phone screen glowed in the dimness, a guest tilting it discreetly under the table. "Look, NYSE, he rang the bell when MedShield went public." The words tumbled out, a mixture of awe and disbelief. More phones appeared, tiny blue lights spreading as guests searched frantically, scrolling through headlines, confirming with photographs and articles what their eyes could hardly believe. Each whisper joined the next until the ballroom no longer belonged to the Kanes' laughter, but to the rising awareness that the quiet man standing with his arm around me was not simply a guest. The DJ, perhaps sensing the shift, lowered the music until only the murmurs remained. Even the chandeliers seemed to glow differently, as though the very light acknowledged the revelation. I did not speak. Kevin did not move. He stood with the calm weight of a man long accustomed to scrutiny, yet uninterested in it. His silence was more powerful than any announcement. Around us, the Kane family faltered. Helen's face stiffened, her practiced elegance betraying a flicker of fear. Grant's smirk had dissolved into a clenched jaw, his champagne untouched. Marissa's eyes darted anxiously between Daniel and her parents, her composure cracking. And Daniel, my son, looked as though the floor beneath him had given way. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his lips parting as if to form words that never came. He stared at Kevin, then at me, then down at the floor. The man who had repeated his mother was lucky to be invited, now stood paralyzed, unable to reconcile the narrative he had embraced with the truth unveiled before him. The murmurs grew louder, layering into one another. MedShield's founder, one of the top innovators in health security. He's worth billions. That's his sister. Each phrase was carried on currents of disbelief, weaving a new story that no one had anticipated. I felt none of their awe mattered. Kevin's silence spoke louder than their gasps. He had come not to flaunt power, but to affirm connection. Yet their reaction, the stunned faces, the whispered confirmations, shifted the balance of the evening entirely. The very people who had laughed at me by the kitchen doors now struggled to hide their discomfort. their gazes flicking between me and Kevin as though they had miscalculated a sum that could not be corrected. I stood beside my brother, steady, my smile faint but resolute. The humiliation I had endured all night melted beneath the weight of this revelation, not because of his wealth, though they obsessed over it, but because his presence shattered the lie that I did not belong. Blood, loyalty, and love stood visible beside me, undeniable in its simplicity. The DJ cut the music entirely. The room sank into a hush broken only by the rustle of silk gowns, the clink of a glass set too quickly on a table, the faint buzz of another phone. It was as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath, waiting for Kevin to say more. But he didn't. He only glanced down at me, his expression calm, his arm still resting lightly on my shoulder. The absence of words became its own kind of declaration. I let the silence stretch. I wanted them to feel it, the weight of recognition, the discomfort of seeing their cruelty illuminated by truth. Helen shifted uncomfortably, her diamonds catching the light, but even they seemed duller now. The whispers did not stop. She's his sister. All this time, imagine humiliating her. They rippled through the room until they wrapped back around to me, carried on the voices of strangers who moments earlier had looked past me without notice. I breathed deeply, the pearls at my throat cool against my skin. My mantra returned, steady and sure. Remember this, not just the sting of exclusion, but this moment of reversal when silence and dignity outlasted cruelty. I looked toward Daniel once more. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling as though he had run a great distance without moving at all. He had wanted so badly to fit into this world, but now he saw what it had cost and what truth looked like when it walked through the door. And still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The room already knew. The ballroom had turned into a theater without a script. Every guest sat poised between curiosity and unease, their whispers dying down as they realized silence itself had become the loudest presence. Kevin remained steady beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. He had not raised his voice, not once, yet the balance of the room leaned entirely toward him. Helen rose first. Her sequined gown glittered beneath the chandeliers, but her composure wavered as she forced a smile. She clutched her champagne flute with fingers too tight, and when she spoke, her words trembled faintly under the varnish of control. "Mr. O'Hara," she said, her voice pitched for civility. "What a surprise! I wish we had known you'd be joining us tonight. We would have prepared properly." Her attempt at charm landed flat. Kevin said nothing, only watching her with a gaze that stripped away the armor of elegance. The silence pressed harder, until even the chandeliers seemed to hum with it. Finally, he asked, his tone calm but unyielding, "Is this how you welcome my sister? By seating her by the kitchen doors and mocking her in public?" The words struck like a bell. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others leaning forward to catch every syllable. The question was simple, but its truth was undeniable. Helen's painted smile faltered further, her throat tightening as though she were swallowing stones. Grant cleared his throat, ready to interject, but Helen lifted her hand quickly, silencing even him. For once her authority wavered not outward but inward, her eyes flicking around the room as if she could find refuge in the faces of her guests. None came. At last she spoke, her voice lower, edged with something raw. "In our world," she said, "all that matters is position. People remember who stands in the center, not the edges. If we don't hold that place, we fall, and falling means being forgotten." It was not an apology. It was a confession, a rare crack in the polished facade. The words revealed not cruelty alone, but the gnawing fear that had driven it. The silence in the room shifted once again, this time with recognition. Helen Kane, who commanded rooms with diamonds and wit, was terrified of losing her place. I felt Daniel's gaze on me. He had heard it too, the admission that exposed the truth behind their treatment of me. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. I saw the fracture in him widening, the boy he had once been straining against the man trying to please his in-laws. Kevin did not respond immediately. He let her words linger, let the guests absorb the confession for what it was. Then he spoke, steady and unhurried. My sister has stood on her own for decades. She taught, she raised her son, she carried her family with dignity. She has never needed chandeliers to shine. And yet tonight, you tried to make her invisible. The room breathed as one, a collective intake of air. Helen's head bowed slightly, her shoulders stiff. Grant shifted uncomfortably, muttering something into his glass. But the silence following Kevin's words was heavier than anything they could muster. Daniel stepped forward then, unable to stay rooted by the head table. His voice trembled, but it carried. "Mom." His eyes glistened under the lights. I didn't know it would be like this. My heart ached at the sight of him. My son torn between the promise of belonging and the pull of truth. He looked smaller than he had all night, his bravado stripped away. Marissa touched his arm, whispering urgently, but he shook his head. His loyalty had begun to splinter, cracks widening where the Kanes had built their fortress around him. I did not move toward him. I did not need to. My silence held him as surely as it held Helen and Grant. Sometimes words fail, but the absence of them forces the truth forward. The guests watched, rapt. Some glanced at me with new respect, others at Kevin with awe, but most turned their attention to the Kane family, whose golden image now shimmered with visible cracks. The confession, the confrontation, and the fracture in Daniel's loyalty had shifted the ground beneath all of us. I lowered my gaze briefly, pressing my hand over the ring Michael had given me. He would have told me to stand tall, to let them reveal themselves. And they had. When I lifted my eyes again, I caught Daniel's gaze one more time. He looked lost, ashamed, yet something softer flickered there. A recognition, perhaps, of the woman who had never abandoned him, even as he stood with those who mocked her. I whispered silently to myself, the same words I had carried all evening. Remember this. The ballroom remained hushed, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. The silence in the ballroom was a silence no music could cover. Kevin remained at my side, steady as stone, his presence turning the glittering hall into something smaller, less certain. Guests shifted, eyes darting, whispers catching in their throats. Helen's hands clutched the edge of the tablecloth. Grant's smirk was gone, and Marissa's smile trembled. Daniel lingered near the head table, his face pale and unreadable. Kevin leaned slightly toward me. "Shall we?" His voice was quiet, unhurried, but it carried the weight of decision. I nodded once. Without another word, he guided me forward. The crowd parted instinctively, the way water divides around a stone. No one dared to stop us. Their eyes followed, wide and uncertain, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air. As we walked, I kept my head high. My pearls caught the light, my heels struck the marble floor in measured beats, and I let every step speak for me. Not anger, not bitterness, only dignity. We reached the far end of the hall where the service door waited, tucked behind a curtain, the same doors the staff had used all night. Just as we approached, they swung open, and there he was, the young server. His tray was empty now, his posture straighter, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. He held the door open, his expression gentle. "Congratulations, ma'am," he whispered. His words were simple, but they glowed brighter than all the chandeliers above. I met his eyes, offering a small nod. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice carrying more gratitude than the words could hold. For a heartbeat, the three of us stood framed in the doorway. Kevin beside me, the young man holding the door, and me stepping forward at last. Behind us, the ballroom had fallen utterly silent. The laughter that once mocked me now vanished. All that remained was the echo of my footsteps and the stillness of those who had witnessed what dignity looks like when it refuses to bend. And as the door closed behind us, the music swelled again, but it no longer belonged to me. I had left that stage, carrying with me something they could never tarnish. Kevin's penthouse overlooked the river, its wide windows framing the dark water like a moving painting. The city's hum drifted upward, softened by distance. I stood near the glass, pearls still around my neck, the weight of the evening pressing down in delayed waves. For hours I had held myself steady, but here, in the quiet, the cracks finally showed. My breath came uneven, my shoulders shaking once, before I pressed my palms against the cool glass. The tears slipped free, hot and unrelenting. They weren't just for the humiliation, but for all the years of holding steady alone. For Michael, gone too soon. For Daniel, lost to pressures I could not shield him from. For the weight of invisibility carried until tonight. Kevin entered the room silently, a glass of water in his hand. He set it down on the table behind me, not speaking, only watching with the patience of a man who knew when words would add nothing. I turned slowly, wiping my face with the back of my hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said simply. I moved toward the armchair near the fireplace and sat down. My small clutch rested on my lap, and with trembling hands I pulled out the card Michael had given me on my last birthday before he died. The handwriting, bold and sure, stared up at me. "You are worth more than this world will ever admit." I pressed the card against my chest, closing my eyes. "Do you see, Michael? I stood tall tonight. I didn't shout, I didn't break, I held on." My voice cracked but steadied again. "You'd have been proud." Kevin sat across from me, silent but present. After a long pause, my phone buzzed softly. A message lit the screen. "Emily, you're not alone." I let out a shaky laugh, wiping fresh tears from my cheeks. Even across the city, even in her own small way, she had reached for me. The girl with kind eyes who knew too well what it meant to be dismissed had reminded me again that dignity does not live in isolation. I leaned back in the chair, holding Michael's card in one hand and my phone in the other, and breathed deeply. The night outside was vast, the city glittering like 1,000 secrets. But within me, something quiet had shifted. The storm had broken, and though exhaustion weighed me down, I felt the faint warmth of healing begin to rise. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. I hesitated before answering, unsure what awaited me. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his suit jacket wrinkled, his eyes tired. In his hands, he held a small, cream-colored envelope. "Mom," he said, his voice raw, "I think this is yours." I stared at it, recognizing instantly the handwriting on the front, my own. It was the letter I had left on the gift table, the one I had written the morning of the wedding, folded carefully around a modest check and words of love. Daniel stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. "Emily found it," he explained, his voice shaking. "It was still in the storeroom with unopened gifts. She brought it to me." His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, sliding out the letter. His eyes scanned the page, moving slowly, his lips parting as though the words cut deeper with every line. I watched him, my chest tightening. He read the last line aloud, his voice breaking. "No matter where life takes you, you will always be enough, because you are my son." Tears slipped down his cheeks. He lowered the paper, his eyes red. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "I stood there and let them laugh at you. I even repeated their words. I don't know why I did it. I was afraid of losing everything they promised me. But the truth is, I lost more by turning away from you. The sight of him crying pulled at every thread in me. For years I had dreamed of protecting him from the world's cruelty, only to watch him join it. Now he stood before me, stripped of pretense, holding the very letter I had written with trembling hope. I breathed slowly, steadying myself. "Daniel," I said, my voice soft but firm, "love is not erased by one night, but respect must be rebuilt. Respect is the starting point. Without it, we have nothing." He nodded, tears falling freely. "I want to try. Please, let me try." I reached out, placing my hand lightly on his shoulder. "Then begin with honesty. Begin with humility. Begin with remembering that dignity is not something you inherit. It is something you grant." He pressed the letter against his chest, nodding again. His breath came ragged, but for the first time in years, I saw in his eyes the boy who used to bring me wildflowers, the boy who once believed I was enough. I didn't promise forgiveness that day. I only promised the possibility. And sometimes, possibility is more powerful than certainty. As Daniel left my house, the envelope still clutched in his hand, I whispered again my quiet vow. "Remember this." A year passed like the turning of a page, each season stitching its quiet thread through the fabric of my life. Winter had yielded to spring, spring to summer, and now autumn had returned with its crisp evenings and amber light. Much had changed in that year, yet some things had remained steadfast. My pearls, Michael's card resting in its wooden box, and the words I whispered to myself when shadows threatened, "Remember this." Kevin had invited me to his home again, though this time not as a refuge but as a gathering place. His penthouse glowed warm against the cool October night, its windows alive with light. From the hallway outside, I could already hear the hum of conversation and the sound of laughter. It was not the brittle laughter of mockery I remembered from the ballroom, but the laughter of friends and chosen family sharing the table as equals. When I entered, I was met with a sight that tightened my throat. Kevin stood at the head of the long dining table, pouring wine into glasses. Around the table sat a blend of faces, some of my old colleagues from the school where I had taught for 35 years, Emily with her bright eyes and warm smile, and even Daniel. Daniel's presence was the most striking change. He looked older, not in years, but in spirit. His hair was a little longer, his tie slightly loosened, but what I noticed most was the humility in his posture. He no longer stood tall with borrowed bravado. Instead, he sat with his shoulders eased, his eyes attentive, his smile small but genuine. When he rose to greet me, there was no hesitation, no stiffness. He embraced me quietly, his voice low. "Thank you for coming, Mom." I held him a little, longer than I meant to, breathing in the unfamiliar but welcome steadiness in him. "Thank you for inviting me," I whispered back. As the evening unfolded, conversation flowed easily. Kevin spoke sparingly, but every word landed with the calm authority that always surrounded him. My colleagues shared stories from the classroom. Chalk dust, science fairs, the small victories of children finding their voices. Emily laughed at each tale, adding her own anecdotes, her energy brightening the room. Daniel listened, nodding, occasionally offering a story of his own, though he chose his words with more care than before. The meal was simple, but abundant. Roasted chicken, bowls of autumn vegetables, warm bread. The kind of food meant not to impress, but to nourish. Candles flickered down the table, casting faces in gentle light. I found myself smiling more than I had in years, not out of defense, not to mask pain, but because joy itself had quietly returned. At one point, Emily lifted her glass. "To Kathleen," she said brightly, "for teaching us what dignity really looks like." The room fell into a warm hush. Glasses lifted in unison. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, humbled by the gesture, but before I could speak, Daniel cleared his throat. His voice was soft but carried across the table. "And to forgiveness," he said. His eyes met mine. "Not because it's owed, but because it can be earned." A weight settled gently in the room, the kind that lingers when truth is spoken aloud. I felt tears prick my eyes, though I blinked them back, offering him only a quiet nod. The journey between us was not complete, but it was real. The boy who had once called me lucky to be invited was learning to measure worth differently now. As the evening wound down, Kevin moved beside me, his hand resting lightly on my chair. "You see," he murmured, "family is not just blood, it's who chooses to stand with you." I looked around the table, the faces glowing in candlelight, the laughter that had become music instead of a weapon, the sun who was beginning to return, the young woman who had reminded me I wasn't alone, and my brother, steady as ever, who had walked into a ballroom and changed the story with 6 simple words. I lifted my glass, my voice calm but certain. "Family," I said, "is those who choose to stand beside us." The words lingered, soft and firm, sealing the night with quiet truth. Around me, smiles bloomed, glasses clinked, and the warmth of belonging filled the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt not invisible, not tolerated, but whole. And as I sat among those who had chosen me, and whom I had chosen in return, I whispered my mantra once more, though this time not as armor, but as gratitude. Remember this: